Greetings everyone, and I hope you're having a nice day. Since I studied both classical guitar and composition, I would like to begin a series of analysis of masterpieces of the classical guitar repertoire. Hopefully, this will help me and you understand these masterpieces better. In this case, I will analyze Ginastera's Guitar Sonata, Opus 47, his only work for guitar. I will be analyzing the first movement. Ginastera was an avid composer and incorporated many folkloric rhythm and dance elements onto his compositions. In this video, I will be analyzing the opening movement of the sonata called Esordio, which means introduction. Here I will be focusing on 5 different topics, which are structure or form, technical aspects, harmony and melody, dynamics, and rhythmic elements. This is my, and I emphasize my, own understanding of this work for classical guitar. As people interpret things differently through their own cognitive process, which is what makes art interesting, this is just my own contribution that will hopefully allow other people to see the piece from a different point of view, while allowing them to add a new layer of understanding of this magnificent work. As you will see throughout the video, the piece has some pencil markings and phrasings which I added while I was studying this piece in my 3rd year of my Bachelor's in Music Performance at the Royal Irish Academy of Music. I believe this piece was not included in the program of elective sonatas, but given that I am from Argentina, the same way Ginastera was, I wanted to undertake such a challenge in order to promote a little bit of Argentine contemporary academic guitar music. I am glad I did, because I ended up absolutely loving this piece. Let's begin. As mentioned previously, the first movement, or Esordio, serves as the opening and introductory movement of the sonata. The movement consists of 2 pages, and by the way it was laid out, each page has its own sense and meaning within the piece. If we consider the first page, we can see this serves almost as an ad libitum free passage. You can see there is no time signature, and that each phrase is not dictated by bar lines or phrasing marks, but rather by these big colons found within the score, and also by the more common use of fermatas. Now that I mention this, I wonder why the editors included these 2 chords on the 3rd system rather than bringing them down to the 4th system. I can conclude it was because maybe the system would become too overcrowded, and the notes would be squashed and almost unintelligible. Each of these 4 phrases open with a series of 4 big resonant chords which are answered with a concept of an accelerating musical direction. See how each of the musical answers begins slowly and gradually increases its speed until getting to the climax of the phrase. There is one exception in the last system, where the direction of the music follows an inverse principle and then gradually slows down towards the end of the phrase and page. It is interesting to see how the 1st and 4th system end with some kind of a similar concept, which is a pitched note, while systems 2 and 3 finish with a special effect called the son sifflet. This is a whistling effect achieved by sliding your fingernail through the indicated string, in this case the 6th. As this is a heavier gauge string and it is also steel wound, then the effect will be more prominent. This page ends with an open, resonant perfect 5th chord made up of E and B, and the respective octaves. Page number 2 has a more stable and less permissive intention. Here we have a strong 3/4 time signature and a slightly faster tempo to generate a contrast from the preceding section. However, this is not kept for long, as the composer goes back to the original tempo in the 3rd system, almost like an echo of the original concept, but with slight variations. These are the amount of chords played, 3 instead of 4, and with the introduction of a new rhythmic variants, the triplets. These triplets have never appeared before, so they add a little new detail to the piece. So in this free section, we have 2 distinct phrases of identical rhythmic nature, 3 chords followed by a triplet response, and then go back to the 4 chords. So now, the 4 big resonant chords appear at the end of the phrase rather than at the beginning. almost as some kind of inversion or mirror. After this short echo of the first page, the piece goes back to the second, more stable tempo, utilizing the big, open resonant chords consisting of all the open strings of the guitar. This almost serves as a prequel to the chant that opens the second page. The chords are the same, but there is a variation. See the difference both in the chord used, introduction of hemiolas, and other techniques used, to be discussed further on. The opening movement ends up with a very melancholic and piano series of ascending harmonics, and to wrap up, finishes the movement with the exact same chord used to open the piece, but played in their natural harmonic state at the 12th fret of the guitar. As I am a visual thinker, this is how I see the piece if I was to assign colors to the different sections. The whole first page would have this random color. Then, at the beginning of the second page, we change the color of the piece to this other random color. There is a short return to the first musical color, but with a slight change. This is followed by the second apparition of the second color, which also has a slight change. Before ending, there is a new complete different musical identity, or color, represented by the apparition for the very first time of the harmonics, and then a somewhat return to a chord belonging to the very first color. So to recap, the structure or form of the first movement has two distinct contrasting colors which intertwine one another in different permutations. The first one has an ad libitum vibe that sees long resonant chords replied with accelerating and decelerating musical ideas. The second, contrasting musical color, has a more steady vibe with a very distinctive rhythmic motif that is replied with the use of effects such as the tambora and tapping on the body of the guitar, inviting the performer to use the guitar's percussive characteristics. Both these ideas reappear with slight variations before entering a slow, melancholic and reflective series of harmonics that finally conclude the movement with the same chord that opened it. A long chord that invites the performer to let it ring at will, given that it involves all open strings. Regarding the technical aspects, I won't go into much detail on things that are obvious, though I will mention them briefly. I will explain the techniques the composer used here and how they sound and can be achieved, which can also be found in the preface of the piece should you decide to buy it. If we follow the score at the beginning, you can see pretty straightforward a very common technique such as rolling a chord. This means the chord is not plucked all at once, for obvious reasons of not having 6 fingers, but it is also not arpeggiated following a certain rhythmic pattern. The chord is spread evenly following the direction of the arrow, so in this case from the bottom string to the top string. In this system, see how the person in charge of the fingering decides to play notes at a certain specific position. This is done for the performer to avoid big jumps on the guitar. Avoiding these jumps will aid in having a cleaner performance with less squeaks. Another way that this fingering helps is by utilizing open strings. Having open strings gives time to the performer to shift their hand without producing any unwanted scratches or squeaks. As explained previously, a distinct characteristic technique the composer uses is the accelerando of these musical phrases. As you can see in the score, the motif starts with the quavers, or 8 notes, and gradually accelerates and changes to semi-quaver, or 16th notes. A very interesting and idiomatic concept. In the second system we see 2 new things to point out. The first is the pedal note A and how the composer ties it to nothing. The intention of this is to let the note ring and not mute it when playing the triads. A new, interesting special effect characteristic of contemporary music is the use of the son sifflé. This can be achieved by sliding your fingernail through the indicated string. This creates an interesting end of phrase and allows the performer to take a little break before developing the subsequent idea. The third system doesn't feature any new technique, but there is one thing worth mentioning. This is how the composer utilizes the laissez-vivre symbol in order to let both the open strings and triad ring as much as possible while executing the son sifflé. The last system of this page utilizes a combination of the previously discussed techniques, but this time with a little twist. As you can probably imagine by now, it has a raising and falling effect when using the accelerando effect. You can see how the musical phrasing accelerates when executing the triad, but then decelerates when executing the intervals, before landing on the last very stable perfect fifth chord. The second page, as mentioned before, has a more stable pulse. The first thing we notice is the tempo change. That helps in generating contrast within the movement. See how the composer picks a rhythmic pattern and sticks to it. This type of rhythms are quite characteristic of Argentine folkloric music. This can be associated to styles and dances such as the cueca, chacareras, gatos, zambas, and more. So I see these bars as a little homage to Argentine music. We can see some interesting percussive techniques such as the tambora. This is great to create that sort of question and answer musical feature many composers work with. Put easily, a certain musical phrase is replied to with a different musical phrase to create some kind of musical discourse. This is obviously super simplified, but it is just a quick explanation of a very basic principle found in music. These techniques are played this way. This is the tambora executed using the thumb, and this is the tambora executed using the palm of the plucking hand. See how in subsequent bars the composer uses the same rhythm defined previously, but playing it in different parts of the guitar. In this case, the performer has to tap on the body of the guitar. It could be on the top, one of the sides, or in the back if wanted, to achieve a percussive effect. This is my understanding, but I believe this is a little homage to folkloric music from Argentina that uses a percussion element called bombo legüero. In such an instrument, the performer usually hits the instrument both in the skin and in the rim. That is a very common characteristic, especially when using polyrhythms such as the 6/8 and 3/4. If we analyze the score for interesting colors and tones, we can see how the composer is very specific about how to execute certain passages. For instance, see how these bars indicate to gradually go from the sound hole towards the bridge to create a ponticello effect. Also, see how this chord should be rolled from the top string towards the bottom string, and the same principle is applied inversely from the bottom string to the top string. This is how they sound. The difference is clear. You will see throughout the piece that the composer uses the concept of shifting the plucking hand quite often. In this example, it indicates that the performer should shift the hand from the bridge to the sound hole. This is an interesting way of changing the color of the tone gradually and seamlessly. To recap this section, the composer uses an array of both classical and contemporary techniques plus elements to create different colors, tones, and special sound effects that add character and personality to the piece. I believe the intention of the overall piece is to combine his formal music education in Europe with sounds and elements from the Argentine folkloric scenery related to the rural areas. As mentioned initially, this is a contemporary work, and not just this movement, but the whole piece. And as such, and I won't generalize here, it is quite unusual to find a clearly defined tonal center within contemporary music. You will find familiar chords and melodies that will make sense within the piece and that will help give the listener a sense of ending or beginning of a musical phrase. However, you will most definitely not find the more common cadences such as perfect, imperfect, broken, 2-5-1, etc., etc. That being said, let's start with the first page, given that we have already established how each page makes sense within the first movement. So as mentioned before, the first page begins with these long resonant chords that combine mostly open strings and intervals. These chords simply combine the use of all the open strings of the guitar with a perfect fourth interval, C and F, and a minor sixth, C sharp and A. These two intervals being connected by a minor second ascent from C to C sharp. The first and fourth chord of these are the same chord, all open strings. This antecedent is replied with a series of ascending arpeggios of perfect fourths. If you see the marks in the score, I have just realized I have the groupings of the notes wrong.
My whole life is a lie.
Okay, sorry about that. So if I erase this and group them correctly, you'll see how the perfect fourths work. We have E, A, D, A, then D, G, C, G, then C, F, B flat, F, and then two groupings of three notes, these were correctly grouped by the way, of the perfect fourths, which are B flat, E flat, A flat, concluding with an octave of the first note of the last group of perfect fourths. Mind blown. As I was analyzing this, I realized something even crazier. So I was wondering what was the relation between this grouping of notes. Were they picked at random or simply transposed to whatever interval the composer felt like? That made me analyze the first note of each grouping, and now we can see that he went for all minor sevenths. So we have E to D, then D to C, and then C to B flat. Really nice. The second system opens up again with four chords and with similarities and differences. The similarities are evident. All open string chords for number 1 and 4, and big resonant long motifs that need to sustain freely. There is a difference in the second and third intervals. The relation of the intervals is the same, having a perfect fourth and a minor sixth. However, this time the motif starts one semitone up when compared to the first iteration. See how it begins with a C sharp rather than a C natural. And another difference is that instead there is an ascent of a major second rather than a minor second. So instead of going from C sharp to D, the composer went from C sharp to D sharp. This time the four chords are replied to with two short tritones where we have E to B flat and then the most common F to B, or from the ancient term diabolus in musica. This interval was avoided in ancient music, even that it was said it was the devil's interval. This is obviously a super simplification, but this interval of three perfect tones was referred to as that. After this, Ginastera proceeds to design an idea and simply transpose it while chromatically ascending. Let me explain. So the idea is formed of seventh and minor chords. The seventh chord is G flat, B flat, F, that resolves onto a minor chord, in this case E, G and B. Before going on, you're probably thinking, but my teacher said that a chord is formed by the tonic, third and fifth. There is no fifth anywhere. Well, no. Sometimes the fifth can be skipped and such a note does not determine the characteristic of a chord. That is the third's job, and it is the one that determines whether a chord is major or minor. That being explained, having established the pattern, you can see how the melody falls by a semitone, F to E, G to F sharp, etc., etc., while the motif keeps ascending chromatically. This repeats 4 times, and I think he did it again now. This is really interesting. Now look at the first note of the pattern. It is an F, and if you analyze the first note of each pattern, then what will you find? Ding 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 ding! A tritone. We have F to G, to A, to B. 3 full tones, and then ending up on the logical chord following the sequence that follows the principle of a full tone on the higher melody, ending on a C sharp. The third system follows the principle of the 4 resonant chords. In this case, the composer transposes the original open chord up a perfect fifth. Is this a quick allegory to classical composers which usually modulate it to the fifth given the close tonal distance? I am not sure. Maybe it is or maybe it is not. I honestly can't find any particular relation or explanation for the second chord if I have to be honest. Maybe I am missing something. But something that I find interesting is the apparition of a diminished pattern on the third chord. This is formed by B flat, E, A, and B flat. I mention this because this very figure or pattern is utilized by the composer many times throughout the whole piece, especially in the last movement. Last chord of the 4-chord series is, as seen before, the all open strings idea that opens up the piece. What follows is quite interesting, as it sounds to me quite like bells from a church. This is the transposition of a pattern, the same way he did in the previous system. In this case, he utilizes major sevenths that jump between strings and he transposes them using a diminished chord idea. Let me explain. The major sevenths are A flat and G, played in third and first string, and then E flat and D, played on the fourth and second string, which are accompanied by the open strings E and A, probably for resonance purposes. He moves the pattern up a minor third. So we originally started on a G, and then we start on a B flat, or its enharmonic value, which is an A sharp. The relation is the same, a tone and a half. After that, he transposes up a minor third again, going from A sharp to C sharp, and repeats the pattern. And then, finally, he moves the pattern one more time a minor third up, going from C sharp to E. If we analyze these notes individually, then we have G, A sharp or B flat, C sharp or D flat, and E. And they are all minor thirds if we analyze them in terms of semitones. This run, if we want to call it that way, ends on a chord that the composer will also use on other movements of the piece, especially the last one. This is a resource many composers use as hints or links between movements, so that they are connected at a subliminal level, given that the contexts are completely different. For the last system, I couldn't find a logical explanation as to why these chords were employed. My understanding is that the composer simply transposed previously utilized chords to generate different colors while ending on the characteristic all open strings idea. So if you see the first chord, it is simply a transposition of the same chord used previously. The same happens with the third chord. It was used in the previous system, but a half step down. See how it was played at the 8th fret, but now it is played at the 9th. I believe it is just a simple transposition of a chordal or idiomatic idea across the fingerboard. The following idea is a series of chromatically descending shapes that develop towards a series of intervals before the stable perfect fifth chord. If we go back to this descending idea, we can see that the bass line descends chromatically following B, B flat, A flat, G, and F sharp or G flat. The chords alternate between diminished and these clusters of major sevenths. See how we have B flat and A, and then E and D sharp. And they increase in speed before landing onto a series of major sixths that end on a chromatic bass line that falls towards the stability of the perfect fifth ending chord. So after the run of sixths, we have a bass line that goes G flat, F, E, while the inner voices go D flat followed by two perfect fourths, A and D, and B and D. The very last chord is a very stable chord that is open enough to invite the piece to further develop. This is just a perfect fifth with different octaves. So we have E plus B plus E plus B plus B, all across the different strings. I think it would have been nice if the composer would have included the high E. In that case, we would have a perfect balance of 3 times each note. As mentioned previously, the second page of this movement is somewhat more stable and with a rhythmic pattern that characterizes it. I find it interesting how the melodic line follows a simple diatonic scale that rises and then falls. If you take just the top note, then we have F, G, A, B, B, A, G, F. The accompaniment for this melodic line is composed mainly of either minor thirds and either perfect or augmented fourths. The first presentation of this idea ends with an interval the composer has emphasized on previously, the major seventh, in this case with a G flat and an F. The second time this idea comes in, the melodic line doesn't rise and fall, but rather just keeps rising. Now we have F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp. See how the composer chooses to use the accidental on the F sharp as a climactic point. This note is the only one in the row that has an accidental, and it will make a greater impact on the listener by being placed on the most important beat, the first one. The composer keeps this F sharp and simply adds all the open strings of the guitar until it lands on a very peculiar double chord. This 6-note chord is basically made up of two different very distant chords. So on the low strings we have E, G and B, or E minor, while on the top strings we have F sharp, A sharp and C sharp, or F sharp major. This chord then goes back to the original long chordal idea of the first page that ends on another double chord. This time we have D flat major on the low strings and D minor on the top strings. Seems like he chose to move this E minor chord from the low strings to the top strings. Interesting and almost as an idiomatic statement, we can see the further employment of major sevenths across the fingerboard. As mentioned before, this is a little recap of the first page. Therefore, we will see chords which have already appeared before, either slightly modified, transposed to different frets, and also these double chord ideas. It is like some sort of variation of a theme that, as any good composer does, respects the fundamental principles of the theme and ends on a very identifiable and familiar chord. In this case, the all open strings idea presented at the very beginning of the piece. After this little echo, we go back to the idea of the diatonic melodic line that rises, but this time he doesn't use the whole line, but just the rising section. As you can see, we have F, G, A and B presented twice. I am pretty sure there is a mistake here and that the editor forgot to add a natural in this particular E flat, especially because the fingering fits an E natural and not an E flat. At the very end of the piece we have a series of long notes, very melancholic and reflective, and I have to confess I couldn't find any specific relation between them, except on the last interval which is a major seventh, but I am not sure it is as intended as it was before. The last chord, which closes the movement, is the composer's way of closing the circle. He employs the very opening chord, but this time an octave higher, via the natural harmonics at the 12th fret. A very resonant chord that can ring for ages on a good guitar. To resume this section, rather than having a strong tonal center, the composer uses certain beacons or referential chords and melodies that he permutates and varies throughout the piece. Ginastera works with ideas rather than tonal centers. These appear in the form of, to name examples, little interludes of major sevenths, runs of diminished chords, transposition of a chordal figure, or even double chords as explained before. For the analysis of the dynamics, I won't go into as much detail as I did with the harmony and melody. However, I will pinpoint some interesting things that make this piece stand out and enhance its impact on the listener. First things first. A very interesting idea is how the piece starts right from the get-go with a triple forte dynamic marking. How many times have you seen pieces that start gradually and try to build up tension and momentum from a piano dynamic? In this case, the composer jumps straight into a really loud dynamic, almost as loud as a guitar can get. Another interesting thing is that throughout the first page, this dynamic doesn't change at all. I am not sure if that is intention or something is missing, but if you follow the score to the dot, then the first page should be played always really loud, and even when you reach the final chord, you have to play even louder. If we focus on the indications, we can assume this idea is actually right. This sempre tutta forza with a nice exclamation mark means always at full force. And if you see further indications, you see how the composer combines a super loud introductory statement with heavy accents. The first time as accented and the second time as very accented. Is that even correct grammatically speaking? A very interesting word the composer uses to describe the initial tempo, solemne or solemne. So basically, honest, genuine, ceremonial, big resonant chords to make a statement. This is my piece and I open it very loud and unapologetically. The second page already begins with a completely new mood and tone. A very soft dynamic marking and a dolce or sweet indication already sees a completely new color within the piece. See how the second page is full of markings for the performers such as tastiera, towards the fingerboard, ponticello, towards the bridge, naturale, at the sound hole, vibrato, and more. The second page plays with different dynamics going from super soft and sweet passages to super duper forte sections. See how the piece creates tension going from forte to double forte to triple forte and towards the maximum quadruple forte. It is very interesting how in the space of 6 bars the composer introduces 6 dynamic changes. In the subsequent bars, we see many dynamic changes and how the movement slowly dies towards a super soft and ethereal mood when the harmonics are employed. Funny enough, the piece ends with a dynamic marking completely opposite when compared to the opening idea. To recap, the dynamic range for the first page is basically loud, like very loud. This works as a statement and goes against the grain of slowly creating a climax. It rather simply kicks in. The second page is used to introduce new tones, colors, and dynamic contrasts that have a playful character and carry the piece to a new dimension. As discussed previously, the movement is divided into 2 very distinct sections. The first having a free and almost improvised feel, and the second one having a more stable and distinct melodic line and elements. The first section works around a series of chordal progressions that work as a question, and then the different ideas and concepts that work as the answer. If we look into greater detail, the first page simply has long chords written in minims and dotted minims, followed by a series of gradually accelerating quavers, which then turn into semiquavers. This happens throughout the entire first page, and with no exception, and it is composed of 4 distinct phrases which conclude on a very stable and easy listening chord. A thing to note is that in this first section, all the rhythms are quite even and there are no triplets, dots or syncopations, except in the minims, but these are not to be followed precisely to the dot. As each phrase works within a stable pulse and even rhythmic figure, the music is evenly paced and easy to follow, in terms of rhythm of course. The second page has a more diverse and interesting set of rhythmic figures and values which add a new flavor and character to this movement. In the first couple of bars, we already see 4 different sets of values. We have dotted crotchet, quaver, crotchet, and minim. A little thing to note. Recently, I have been investigating a very interesting book by Rimsky-Korsakov called
Principles of Orchestration.
Besides having very enlightening principles of orchestration and how instruments work best, it also has a chapter that refers to melodic lines. If I am trying to simplify this, it basically says
A good melodic line has, at least, 3 different rhythmic values.
This is very important, because it really helped me shape my melodic lines after reading such a statement. If we apply this principle here, we can see that this section, in which we have a distinct melodic line, we see this principle applied to perfection. An interesting thing that the composer introduces in this second page is the appearance of triplets for the very first time. He only uses this rhythmic value in 2 sporadic musical phrases before going back to the original rhythmic pattern that governs this second page, this being defined in the very first 2 bars of the page. If we analyze it a little bit, we can see this pattern, or cell, is found within various voices of the instrument and/or techniques. For instance, it originally appears within chords and melody, but it also shows up when he chooses to add some percussive features of the guitar. A very interesting idea that appears towards the end of the movement is a hemiola. When looking at the first 2 bars of the last system, you can see how the composer chooses to accent the taps on the guitar every 2 crotchets. This goes against the natural flow of a 3/4 rhythm, where the strong beat is always the first one. Therefore, we have accents on beats 1, 3, and 2. Let me clarify that a polyrhythm of 3/4 against 6/8 is a very common characteristic of Argentine folk music. I know this is not 6/8, but if you consider both bars as 1 and make it a 6/8 then the 3 beats, subdivided into groupings of 2, would perfectly fit this principle. To recap this section, we see the composer uses defined sets of rhythmic values for the 2 very distinct moods of this very first movement. The first one has conservative and stable rhythms. This is mainly driven by the nature of this section, which serves as an introduction and discourses of different musical phrases. The second page employs a more stable and recognizable set of rhythmic values, which he employs across the different sonic and percussive possibilities of the guitar. He introduces rhythms that will be found in subsequent movements of the sonata, and utilizes the second page as a complete new chapter within the movement. As a wrap-up for the whole first movement, we can clearly see there are 2 distinct chapters, if you want to call them that way. This is an introductory movement, as stated in the title, that starts very loud and unapologetically. So rather than creating a slow build-up, it dives straight in with a very distinct opening. The movement is characterized for having a more free and improvised character at the beginning, and then it shifts towards a more stable and melody-driven second section. The composer incorporates elements from Argentine folk music that emulate autochthonous instruments and rhythms. This first movement isn't particularly difficult to achieve from a technical point of view, but it has loads of dramatic and interesting features that will challenge the performer's expressive skills in order to correctly achieve all the colors and intentions proposed by the composer. Thanks very much for making it this far. If you liked it, please feel free to give it a like, a share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I am hoping to release more content soon, but sometimes life happens. Anyway, have a great day. Bye!